Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second shelf on this very dreary and grey Sunday, 2nd of December. You probably can see from the lighting. I mean, it's 10 o'clock in the morning when I film this, but I need artificial light, although I have a big window right over there because it's so grey and dark. But anyway, this is not your regular recent reads, but it's a non-fiction November wrap-up because, as you all know, November was Non-Fiction November, an event organized every year by Olive from a book Olive and Gemma from Non-Fic Books. And I participated, so let's see how well I did, shall we? Well, let's start with the good news first. I read quite some non-fiction in November. I mean, I do read a fair amount of nonfiction anyway, but in November I always try to read at least 4 or 5 nonfiction books instead of 2, and I managed to do that. The bad news is that I didn't really stick to my TBR, but what did you expect? I mean, I'm not a TBR person. I picked 4 books for the TBR, and the prompts, I will leave a link to my TBR video down below, and I managed to read 2. Barely. But anyway, let's get into the books. The first book I read was, of course, not on my TBR, and that was Anne Rule's book, The Stranger Beside Me, first published in 1980, but amended 2 or 3 times, updated, as it were. It's a book about the Ted Bundy case, about Ted Bundy, and Anne Rule knew him personally. They were friends. They met when they both worked at a suicide helpline. I'm not going to talk long about this book because I already talked about it in my recent reads on November 11th, so I will leave a link to that video down below. You can check it out if you are interested in a more extensive review. I liked the book. I thought it was very interesting, especially because it gave a perspective from somebody who knew Ted Bundy as a regular person. That gave a certain flavor to the book, and the book also gives really good in-depth information about Ted Bundy's life, about all the murders he committed, and about the court cases. So if you are interested in that kind of true crime, I can certainly recommend the book. The second book I read was actually on my TBR. Yeah, me. And that was Unthinkable. Let me hold it this way so you can see the cover. Unthinkable by Helen Thompson. An extraordinary journey through the world's strangest brains. It's a new release from this year, 2018. Now, Helen Thompson studied neuroscience, and then she became a science writer. And this book tells 9 tales of people who have some kind of extraordinary brain, either because they have a brain disorder, or because they had an accident, or because their brain functions in a way that you would call extraordinary. So, for instance, Helen Thompson meets somebody who has a perfect memory, so to speak, somebody who can remember every day of their life, the date, what weather it was, what they did, what kind of events happened on that day. So she travels through the world, all over the place, and meets those people, and she also gives historical cases that are related to that specific brain function that she is exploring. As I said, it's 9 tales, and I think I liked the book, but it didn't give much new information. I read already so many books about, the brain and these cases that she explores, that it didn't really nourish me in any new way. But I think if you are interested in the brain and the history of brain research and these extraordinary cases, but you haven't read a lot about it, then this is a perfect book to start, to see whether it really interests you, whether you want to read more in-depth books about certain cases. The writing style is very journalistic, so it's not sciencey in the sense that it puts you off because it tells you a lot of science and uses a lot of terms that you won't understand. I think it's a perfect introductory book. It's just if you already have read a lot about the brain, then it doesn't really add anything to it. But for people starting with this subject, it's a really good book. Moving on to book 3, a book that was not my TBR either, and that is Dava Sobel's The Glass Universe, published in 2016. For those of you who like to read popular science books, Dava Sobel might be a familiar name. She's an American author. I will leave a link to her website also down below, because she writes popular books about science. And her most famous one, I think, is Longitude, about Jack or John Harrison, the man who tried to solve the longitude problem. Sailors couldn't in the 18th century, you couldn't measure where you are exactly, and he invented what we now call the chronometer. I think that's her most famous book, but she also wrote a book about Galileo's daughter. So if you are interested in this kind of popular science books, you should definitely check out her backlist. The Glass Universe is about astronomy. It focuses especially on female astronomers in the late 19th century until the mid 20th century at Harvard Observatory, where women helped classify the stars, find out where which star was and what kind of distance you had. A new kind of photography was invented. So if you are interested in astronomy, I think this is a perfect book. It's quite dense, also because it gives you a lot of information and a lot of names in very, compressed form. So it's not a fast-paced read. But I thought it was really interesting. It was well written. And although it focuses on the forgotten female astronomers who did such brilliant work in the late 19th and early 20th century, it doesn't exclusively tell the story of these women. So you get a really broad overview over the astronomy and the advances that astronomy made during those 50 or 70 years. For all of you who are interested in that subject, I can certainly recommend this book. The next book was also not on my TBR, but that I'm sort of not bothered by it because I reread this book every November, NonfictionNovember, and I don't put it on my TBR. And you might be surprised because it's Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, which came out, I think, in 2015. Yeah, 2015. You can see that I'm working my way through this book all the time. For those of you who might not know the book, I mean, Elizabeth Gilbert, of course it's a book about, you can call it a self-help book. I'm not ashamed to say that. And it's about trying to incorporate creativity into your life. And I think it's interesting, especially for people who want to do something creative, whether it's visual arts or music or, like me, writing. But you have to balance that with, earning money and not knowing whether you are successful. There's a lot of that, a lot of things in that book that I sort of, frown upon a little, the way Gilbert sees creativity or inspiration as sort of, living beings, sentient beings. I just skip over that because I don't buy into that. But for the rest, I think it's a really down-to-earth, helpful book for people, like I said, who want to do something creative, maybe write a book, but don't know how they should go about it, and how do you, overcome your self-doubts. So I really like it. It helped me a lot quite some time ago, in 2010, 2011. I was struggling with wanting to become a writer and leaving my job as a lawyer, but I didn't know how to do it. And then I started to write a book, and and when I came across this in 2015, it really helped me get a couple of things straight. And one of the most important things that I learned from the book is that there is a big difference whether you want to make a living out of your creative endeavors, or whether you want to do them and earn your living elsewhere. And for me personally, that helped me sort of balance these two things. So I think for people who want to explore their creativity, want to do something, but don't have a trust fund to live on, this is a really helpful book, even though some of the more etherical theories about, the sentient beings of ideas might not appeal to you. It didn't appeal to me, but I still really like the book. And like I said, I reread it regularly just to sort of keep me on track. And then November was almost over, and I thought, well, I read quite some nonfiction, but I only read one book out of my TBR. So I just, the last couple of days, I had to at least read a second book, and I chose this one, Louise Gilder, The Age of Entanglement. This is about physics, quantum physics. So if you're not into that subject, just skip. But if you're interested, if you're only even slightly interested in quantum physics, the exploration from Einstein in the early 20th century until the mid 20th century, Heisenberg with his uncertainty principle. But you are not a physicist, unlike Louise Gilder, who studied physics, then this is a perfect book, because it's really well written. There's a lot of anecdotes and dialogues between the protagonists, invented dialogues, of course, for the most part. Not all of them, by the way, invented, but it is really well explained, and you do not need any pre-knowledge about the field. What you do need is an interest in it, of course, otherwise it will bore you to death. But if you are like me, I had the last time I really studied quote unquote physics was in high school. So I don't have any scientific knowledge about it, but I'm really fascinated with the subject. I'm fascinated with the people in that field, especially people like Einstein and Pauli and Heisenberg, and their discussions about how the world works in quantum mechanics. Then this is absolutely a perfect book. It is quite a junker, and it's dense in the sense that you get a lot of information. But Louise Gilder did a really good job in balancing the scientific background information and the explanation about science with the life of Einstein, for instance, and some anecdotes about people he meets. So it is very, very readable. And I would recommend this book to anybody who has interest in physics, and especially in quantum physics. And then there are the two books on my TBR that I haven't read, and that those two are Dead Girls, a collection of essays by Alice Bollen, and The Search for Richard III, The King's Grave, about the excavation of King Richard III's grave. But you know, you can read nonfiction even if it's not November. So I hope that I will get to these two, if not this year, then early next year. So this was it for my Nonfiction November wrap-up. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments whether you participated in Nonfiction November and how you did, whether you read more nonfiction or any nonfiction. I'm really curious about that, and I'll see you all soon in my next video. Bye-bye.